African Renaissance Podcast. African Renaissance Podcast. African Renaissance Podcast.
I want to start again with the question of the post-colony, which has been a preoccupation of your scholarship and the scholarship of many, many peoples. And this entity of, or an object of your critique, which is the African continent. And you have consistently insisted on viewing it, assessing it as a single entity. Of course, with many and sometimes contradictory, diversified experiences. 2026. What would you say is the state of the post-colony today?
I invented the term post-colony as a result of a deep meditation on the work of Frantz Fanon, whom, as we know, spent most of his short time on earth, because he died at a very young age, trying to make sense of what it meant to be colonized, what it meant to live in under a regime of subjugation, of domination, which itself was premised on the principle of race superiority, inferiority, and so on. So what I tried to do in those years, I think it was in the late 90s, early 2000, was to more or less ask the same question in relation to these social and political formation which resulted from so-called decolonization. I wanted to make sense of what it meant for us, especially in Africa, to go through those years after our purported liberation. What forms of power were invented, how were social relations of production crafted, what we thought of our identities, and what directions, in short, our own continent was taking, what role was it playing in the world. So that was the thinking around the notion of the post-colony. I will not go into more academic discussions, especially in terms of what is the difference between a post-colony and the post-colonial, or the post-colony and the decolonial, the post-colony and the anti-colonial. This will take us too far away, probably, from the subject. All that I want to say is that the term, the post-colony, is not exactly the same thing as any of what I have just alluded to. So your question is, in 2026, where are we? I think we are in a world that is undergoing a deep structural process of fracturation. Fracturation meaning being divided into small bits and conflicting parts. A world in which what brings us all together, these different parts, is not very clear. Witness, for instance, the weakening of what we call multilateralism, the coming together of different states to agree on a minimal consensus. That is no longer really the case. It seems to me that we are experiencing a deep, I call it, brutalist turn. Brutalism in the sense that more and more is resolved through the use of force and coercion. Brutalism in the sense that the violence inflicted upon the most vulnerable amongst us and the most fragile, that violence is increasing. In fact, there is an injunction. There seems to be an injunction to brutalize the weakest amongst us. And the poor are somewhat constrained to fight against among themselves, poor against the poor. There is a contraction of our consciousness and a kind of visceral urge to construct, to build walls, to multiply boundaries, borders, to weaken social relations, and to exclude whoever we can. The case is no longer, the political is no longer about how we bring everyone together. It's more and more about who is it that we exclude and in what name is it that we have to exclude, both nationally and internationally. So the picture I'm describing is pretty dramatic, but I think that we owe to ourselves that lucidity if we are to do anything about the mutating forms domination is taking in these times of ours.
May I invite you to the sort of detailed description of the last, maybe it's 70, 60 odd years since the liberation of Ghana. How do we describe the forms of political self-determination that have attained in the continent? And in what way have they differed really to what came before, which was this colonial, racial humiliation of the peoples of the continent across the board? The African experiment with freedom, with liberation, with decolonization. Are you able maybe to name this post-era? What has defined this 70 years from a political form point of view?
One would have to rely here on the historical. We have to go a little back to history in order to answer this key question of yours. What strikes me both as an historian and a critique of the political, is the what I would call the permanence of tyrannical forms of power in our continent over a long period of time. I would argue that the dominant modality of exercising power in our continent over the last 3 to 4 centuries has been tyrannical. Of course, under many different guises, with many modalities of so-called legitimation, justification, ideological justifications, but all in all, tyrannical, autocratic, or despotic, if you want. And this deep, long-term trend was, so to say, not necessarily introduced by colonialism. There were indigenous forms of despotism which existed before colonialism, which were contested too. They were not the only ones, but they did exist. What the slave trade and colonialism did, both settler colonialism and other forms of colonialism, what they did is that they instrumentalized those despotic traditions. The institution of the chief, for instance, in many parts of the continent, is the result of that effort to instrumentalize in endogenous traditions of tyranny. And of course, after decolonization, formal decolonization, we have seen persistence of those forms, their mutations, whether under the guise of military rule or civilian rule under one-party states and so forth and so on. So, 60 or 70 years after decolonization, we are still, most African people in the continent are still living under despotic and tyrannical regimes. The other historical fact we have to keep in mind when we think about the now, our predicament now, is that there have been important moments when this despotic paradigm has been heavily contested. Such was the case, for instance, with anti-colonial struggles, most of which did contribute to the advent of decolonization. Most of these struggles were embracing, to a large extent, liberal democratic ideas. For instance, most of these struggles were predicated upon the principle of equality between all human beings, that we are all born free and equal. That's a key element of liberal democracy, but which is universal, which is not African, which is not European, which applies to all. The fact of originary equality between all of us. Most of them were predicated upon the refusal of exploitation, economic exploitation. Most of them were predicated upon the principle of government by consent. The fact that as an individual, I have to consent to those who rule over me. And I also think that that is a universal principle. None of us should be constrained to be ruled by authorities to whom we haven't given our consent. The other principle of deep anti-colonial struggles was the fact that those who rule over us must be elected. And that too, I think, is a good principle which should be valid not just for Africans, but for every human being. So when we say, I hear some people today saying, democracy, liberal democracy is not for Africans, I want them to tell me a bit more about where, in this argument, where do they put all these historical experiences of people fighting for these rights and these principles? What do they make of that? Why were they fighting for such principles if indeed those principles are anti-African? I don't believe, of course, I think it's not even an argument. Historically, it doesn't make sense. So I believe that is something in the broad idea of liberal democracy we have to hold on to. We did then, we have to do it today, and I think it's good if we are to emerge out of the crisis of despotism and tyranny, which is a key aspect of our contemporary predicament. Because you ask me, okay, where are we? We are at a point where 70 years, 60, 70 years later, the forms of rule which have prevailed after decolonization have not resolved the crisis of accumulation we are facing, in the sense that very few governments have been able to preside over the production of enough wealth which would allow us to deal with the basic needs of our people. Food, clean water, healthcare, education, none of that has been resolved. We are still saddled everywhere in the continent with the dictatorship of basic needs. And despotism has not resolved that question. Nor has it resolved the question of freedom you were raising early on. And we see it at work in the manner in which elections, for instance, in the continent are conducted. Every single election in most parts of Africa today is conducive to all kinds of disorder and bloody outcomes, as we see everywhere. In Tanzania the other year, a bit more than 1,000 people killed in the context of elections. Same thing in Cameroon. Even in advanced democracies like Senegal, 80 young people killed in the context of struggles around who will rule us and in what name. So the question of wealth making, the question of satisfaction, the satisfaction of our basic needs, the question of freedom and dignity, despotism hasn't resolve those questions. So it seems to me it's time, with what we have seen, to try something else. We have to invent other modalities of self-rule and self-determination if indeed these two key challenges have to be met. This requires, of course, a different understanding of our continent. What is it? Is it just a juxtaposition of arbitrary states, most of them crafted by imperialism in the second half of the 19th century? Or is it a different project that we really want to put together? If that is the case, what form can it take? How do we relate to each other at a time when those who are against the continent are bent to divide us and bring us to fight against each other?
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we can return to some questions that in many rooms seem like they are axioms, like they are some everybody assumes. This idea of, particularly in light of the divisions, the sort of fracturation that you were describing. The Berlin conference's sort of ongoing curse, break them apart into smaller unworkable entities. I wonder if we can sort of canvass these basic grounds again. First one being, why do you insist on the African continent is big. It is the single biggest united land mass with a sense of oldest history on earth. But I'm saying, isn't it too big to think of it? Isn't it too big to want to constitute a single political, economic, and social project for those who celebrate and who insist on this fracture? For instance, the OAU, when it was formed, leave the borders the way they are, may be making this argument that it's too big to resolve as a whole, as an entity. Are you able to take us through what is at stake? Why Pan-Africanists, African scholars? I mean, you don't find any other part of the world that insists Asia doesn't have an Asian project. There's nothing between China and Russia. They are neighbors. They've constituted different paths of development. And when you look to the other side of China, India, your Singapore and all those city-states, up to Europe, because Europe is also part of Asia, really, Eurasia. And then you've got North America, you've got Latin America. This insistence, can you walk us through why insist on the unity of the continent in critique as well as in socio-economic praxis?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good distinction you introduced between, let's say, the domain of critique and that of practical political organization. Now, just in terms of the unity of the land mass, I mean, the United States of America is pretty big. It's there's not one single country in Africa that can pretend to have the same physical outreach, spatial outreach, and capacity to absorb many people coming from a whole variety of places on earth, and turning all of that into a powerful vector capable of having a weight of its own in the geopolitics of the world. You take China, I mean, America, one can say it's recent, but you take an entity such as China. China's land mass is a bit less than ours, and yet over at least 1 millennium, it has been able to constitute a power relatively united, which has held itself and organized its rise in a methodical, systematic manner, taking carefully into account other forces in the world and how it interacts with them. I mention those two examples to show that it's not far-fetched to, or it's not demanding too much for a continent such as ours to think beyond the physical strictures of the Berlin era, Berlin Conference, when Africa was carved out into small and viable. They are not really viable, neither economically nor politically, at least if the unit of measurement is the world.
Yes.
So a number of thinkers have tried to show us that our capacity to determine ourselves will depend precisely on our capacity to come together. The list is very, very long. We know all of them. From those from the diaspora who came up first with the idea of Pan-Africanism, to Nkrumah, to Kenyatta, to Sheikh Anta Diop, who developed from a theoretical point of view, who showed us what were the foundations of African, cultural foundations of African unity, cultural, economic, everything in fact forces us to come together if we are to matter. But if we don't need to matter, that's something else. We just stay where we were left by our colonizers. Now, of course, there have to be a method in the coming together. When the OAU met in the early 60s, it decided that the borders inherited from colonialism had to remain the way they were. Many were afraid of the fact that modifying them would open up the Pandora box of wars, of conflicts, disorder, instability, and that we were better keeping things within the national borders that were existing then. Those borders have been, one has to be honest, internalized. People are ready to fight to keep them in place. We have many instances where in some countries local citizens are willing to risk a lot to keep them in place and keep out those who do not belong. But we also have examples of countries that have imploded, collapsed into themselves. Sudan, for instance, is an amazing case study in that matter. First, South Sudan went its own way. Now, as I speak, I don't even know whether there is a state we can call Sudan. Many are predicting that it will be partitioned again. When I say partitioned, one has to imagine the amount of life, the amount of blood that is being spilled.
As we speak.
As we speak, the destruction, the terrible fate of ordinary citizens is not a party. Libya is divided nowadays, I don't know, with warlords controlling spaces. What's going on in Mali is very worrying. I mentioned Mali, but also Burkina Faso, Niger, with the kind of proposal for violence which is carried out by a number of religious and political forces. So all of this to say what? All of this to reiterate the fact that if we are to matter, when I say we, I mean African people, because whether we like it or not, the notion of African people does exist. If it doesn't exist with us ourselves, other people see us as such, and they act on that representation. The way we treat ourselves or we treat each other in the continent has an effect indeed on how people of African descent, black people if you want, are treated elsewhere by others. So there's no escaping our having been born, being located, exercising our existence on this continent. Of course, many can deny that. What I'm saying is that there is an objective factor which makes it such that we belong here. And the fact of belonging here should, in principle, carve out for us a space in the world at large where we can legitimately aspire to be free, and to be free of want, from the yoke of basic necessities. It should, in principle, provide a space for these category of human beings, provide them of a space to move freely and to choose to settle somewhere without harm. That should be the horizon. I don't see any other way for the continent to matter in the brutal world we have entered in if consciously, with full clarity of mind and purpose, we do not constitute ourselves as a force. This cannot be done on a national basis. So we have to reactivate the sub-regional organizations that have been put in place, ECOWAS, SADC, Of course, that's a road we can take. We can implement the ZCAF project, which is very economical. I mean, it's on economic matters, but it has to go beyond economy. It has to be political, it has to be intellectual. We have to open the continent onto itself as a precondition for its self-determination. If we don't do that, we are opening the door for very powerful and cruel forces which will take over our riches, our lands, our bodies, and use them the way they have been using them since the 16th century.
Earlier, you described the tyrant. If there is a tyranny, there's a tyrant. The African despot, the other term that you used. One casts the eye in different parts of the world and you find tyrants. The tyrants of Asia. The tyrants of Asia have more or less managed to take the bull by its horn, the yoke of necessities. They've managed to, in China, resolve poverty and set off on a developmental trajectory that has resulted in their repositioning and revival as an important country that matters in the world. What is it about African tyrants before we think of a different model? Because perhaps it is not in the models. Why are the tyrants of the continent since 1954, with the exception, I suppose, of something like Haiti, because Haiti is in Africa, but it's Africans. But why are these tyrants, in their tyranny, in their despotism, in their authoritarianism, unable to perform the way China, the way many of these other Vietnamese, one-party states, kingdoms that are under, royal families and all of that? What's wrong about the ones in the continent? Why are they not able to perform?
Let's see, it's a very complex question. And we have to, once again, think about it historically. Historically, Africa has encountered, let's say, ruling elites, ruling classes, if you want, in Africa. Hegemonic classes have always encountered a big difficulty. The difficulty of, if you want, putting their people to work, by which I mean, in the capitalist system, exploiting them, putting them to work in order to extract profit from their labor. It has been a historically entrenched problem well before colonialism, a problem which colonialism itself didn't really resolve. It resolved partly here and there, but overall, no. This has been the case. We were talking of the mass, the land mass, has been the case because for a long time, Africa has been underpopulated. You didn't have the same kinds of population density one found in Europe or in Asia in particular over a long time. By which I mean that if, let's say, a ruling class in Buganda wanted to exploit their subjects, of course their subjects could always run away and settle somewhere else.
And find a space where there's no one.
Yes.
Which is equally a fruitful land to make living.
Absolutely. So this, let's call it an exit option, this capacity to escape the encroachment of those who rule has been a key feature of the African continent over centuries, especially with the slave trade, which depopulated, and I say the slave trade meaning the Atlantic slave trade and the Arab slave trade. Millions of people were taken off the continent, taken out, and those who remained were not able to create dense formations enough to allow for that modality of exploitation, of capitalist exploitation. So it's not a cultural character. It has to do with the whole ecology, if you want, the environment, the climate, all these factors, socio-environmental factors, demographic, which allow for certain forms of power as opposed to others. Then there is the fact that both historically and objectively, the fact that with the exception, I would say, of in fact South Africa, industrialization in its classical sense never really happened in the continent. I mentioned industrialization in relation, of course, to colonialism. Even in South Africa, it happened in the late end of the 19th century. So colonialism has not been able
to industrialize Africa.
Yes, it wasn't the purpose elsewhere. It wasn't the purpose in most settler colonies. It was the purpose here, probably because of the number of whites who settled here, as opposed to Zimbabwe, Kenya, Namibia. Numbers were not big enough. So that has been a big problem. And it doesn't mean that capitalism is impossible in the continent. No, one has to define what form of capitalism. But it raises a structural historical question we have to solve differently. We have to solve it by inventing other models of economic growth, if you want. Models may be based on cooperation as opposed to competition, which is the way in which capitalism works. It puts you against somebody else, you compete, and the strongest one wins. So maybe we need to imagine models of economic development which rest very much on cooperation as opposed to competition, or side by side with competition. We have to invent models of political institutionalization which are very decentralized, as opposed to being totally Jacobinistic and centralized. And in fact, some of the most successful African kingdoms and empires, some of which lasted for centuries, rested precisely on such models of horizontal solidarism, if you want, as opposed to the type of model which came from the outside. And those endogenous ways of organizing common life, we have to dig into them and use them to relaunch the project of self-determination, of freedom and well-being, which despotism hasn't resolved, neither colonial nor post-colonial despotism.
You seem to be making, or I sense a certain tension. The Berlin Conference closed the exit option. It made, for the first time, it seems to me,
Right.
the exit option to come with a sense of danger, risk, but as well as constant internal fracture. It makes sense because part of how the Afrikaners, for an example, get described, including in their own legend, is the Great Trek, is this constantly exiting settler-wide population until the exit option was no more. The tension I'm sensing is in this comparison with gigantic states that are targeting Africa, that we are unable to withstand the hunger of these population density areas or areas of population density such as the United States, Europe, and China that constantly need, in order to survive, resources of the continent, and that such a need creates the conditions for the perpetuation of our exploitation, of our abuse, of our unfreedoms. That in order to think about our survival, one ought to actually make peace with the option of exit to be normal. That this opening up is not really in the interest of this exit, but is to unite. Is that if we are to matter, we have to think in those terms of continental or at least regional, that there must be a Southern African community that acts as one. It may be able to constitute an economic project that can withstand the challenge outside of the continent. So, and it seems to me the tension I'm identifying in response to the question, what about African tyrants makes them incapable? Why have they been so parasitic? Why have they been unable to see these modalities and constitute these projects for the survival of their own people? At the same time, you seem to say it's because, of the exit option, but at the same time, the continent has been closed for over a century, and the endangerment of its movements or the population movement has come with massacre, has come with, which was not the case before. I don't know if the tension for me, you are able to, to reconcile it or to dilute it.
Okay, I understand the question. But here again, a little bit of history. Because what happens from, in particular, the 16th century onwards, I would say mostly up to the 19th, but in fact, one can push it further. What happens is that the continent, in various modalities, enters into commercial relations, in particular with Europe, but of course also on the eastern front of the continent with Asia, India, China, etc. But let's just concentrate on the Atlantic side.
Mediterranean
too, with the main relationship, commercial, at the birth and on the eve of the emergence of capitalism, the main connection is with Europe, and the continent is embedded in these, in fact, geo currents, which also includes, of course, the Americas, the triangular trade, Africa, Europe, the Americas. It enters into this triangle saddled, if you want, with the key structural feature we have spoken about, the inability to exploit its own people because of all the geo-environmental factors I have referred to. What it does then, during that period of time, what is easiest for the ruling elites is to capture people and use them as commodities in this global trade. So it's easier for the elites to capture people, sell them into slavery, rather than putting them to work in the continent itself. Just imagine where the continent would be today if, instead of shipping to the Americas the 20 or so million people, shipping to Arabia and other lands the 13 or so million people, where Africa would be today if we had been able to put those people to work in our own land. We would be somewhere else. So the elites, the African elites who participate in the slave trade have an interest in precisely this configuration. And they are abetted by external actors who provide them with guns, provide them with the material coercive resources to keep the business going. So we have tyrants, local as well as regional, who emerge in the process, an entire culture of cruelty and violence on bodies, on minds, which accompanies this material process. We have all of that is becoming entrenched, institutionalized, routinized, until, of course, colonialism happens. So what becomes important for those local tyrants is the control of what happens at the interface between local societies and external merchants who come to buy all kinds of goods, slaves, ivory, etc., etc.
A comprador merchant
Absolutely.
class. Okay.
Yes, because what they are interested in is in controlling those interfaces and using them, privatizing those interfaces, using them to accumulate privately and losing sight of any idea of a common good, of public good. In a context in which their societies themselves are not strong enough to have them to account to their societies. They account to external forces, which is not the case of Asian tyrants, because the structure, social structure, historical structure is different. So what I'm trying to say is that if we want to get out of that conundrum, we absolutely need, from a historical point of view, to strengthen the forces of civil society and create systems in which leaders are accountable to their people. Because African forms of despotic rule prevailed were precisely all channels of accountability to their own people have been destructured and destroyed. So we need to make sure that the balance between civil society and the state is recrafted in the benefit of the society, as opposed to that of the state. For the time being, almost everywhere in the continent, that balance is in favor of predatory classes, predatory rulers, and not at all in the benefit or at the advantage of civil society. That's why the democratic project is absolutely important, because the democratic project rests on the prevalence and power of civil society and its capacity to control all the other forces of privatization in particular. But talking about democracy, one has to think here in terms of substantive democracy as opposed to just formal democracy or multipartism. Democracy is not exactly multipartism. You can have as many political parties as you want. It doesn't mean that you're a democratic society. Substantive democracy is something else. The power of society brings society back in, its forces, its knowledges, its institutions, its capacity to connect, and its capacity to relate, including internationally. Because these days, it's very difficult to make a clear-cut separation between what is international and what is local. The two have to be harnessed as a way of getting out of the conundrum in which the forces of predation, the struggle for predation and capturing has become much more important than the capacity to control the forces of production, which is our predicament as we speak.
And then comes the tragedy of what you have termed conviviality. Isn't it true that the argument up to this point treats the people as the people, the oppressed, the subaltern subject, as if it is an inactive subject upon whom a tyranny or a tyrant acts, upon whom colonizers act, upon whom the predator predates. And yet, in your meditation, you actually lead us to the dark side, the sort of difficulty, which for me comes back to the question of the very possibilities of the emergence of an organized, self-sufficient civil society, able to hold whoever leads accountable. What then of conviviality? What then of the people's participation over these centuries in their very castration, in their very predation, in their very sometimes in their very massacres? And maybe we could extend the question to say, because you will start by saying again, let's start with history, which I accept. What would be the status, if you were to put it today, of conviviality? And what are these conditions that make conviviality to persist?
Two things. First of all, you're right that of the people or of society, the subaltern, the poor. We cannot entertain a romantic nation of any of those categories, both from an analytical point of view and on the basis of just sheer sociological observations. Because those categories themselves have to be disassembled, and you will laugh at me, historicized. So it is true, and I'm not saying that this is quote unquote African, this is universal. Subjugated, dominated people, poor people can actively partake of the oppression that they are subjected to, which doesn't mean that they are stupid or irrational. Usually this is the result of calculations which take into account factors just sheer rational explanation is leaving aside. And things like religion, things like sense of belonging, passions, all of that can run against the sheer profit-making calculations of the individual actor. And I really believe that we live in an age when those visceral passions, maybe today they matter more than they have never mattered before. Or in any case, they are amplified to a point we have not seen before, partly thanks to the miniaturized technologies which have become part and parcel of our everyday existence. So today it's very easy to mobilize and deploy those visceral, and I say visceral for good reasons, because they really come from the, we say in French, les tripes,
the stomach.
Yes, yeah, it comes from the
gut, yeah.
The gut. Gut politics is a key defining feature of the time we live in, and it has a long future ahead of it. So the question of how we deal with guts is key. How do we make sure that an regulated deployment of the guts factor does not lead to self-demolition and self-destruction, as we're seeing it? I mentioned Libya, Somalia, Sudan, all of that. And South Africa is not at all exempt from the potential consequences of a sheer liberation of the guts. I mentioned South Africa, this is where we live, but I can say it for any other African country, or for that matter, non-African. So that is one area of thinking that we have to keep in mind. There is also, when we look at the anthropology of our societies over a long period of time, we have a certain number of resources, cultural resources. And we have developed forms of reciprocity, solidarity, horizontal ways of coming together, a sense of common being, which has been a key part of our capacity for resilience. Resilience in the face of multiple assaults on our being, our environment, who we are. That's why we are still here today. We wouldn't be here today without those that underlying capital. Let's call it social capital, whatever. A community capital, a capital to invent the in common, which is a key resource we cannot lose sight of if we want to emerge. Resist, of course, but most importantly, stand up, move from the injunction for sheer survival to real existence, meaning existence where you stand up on your own feet. So maybe conviviality is not the name for that capital I'm talking about. Maybe conviviality is more about complicity, how complicit we are with what destroys us and what destroys social relations, because that is today, as far as I'm concerned, the key danger that of really believing in the fictions they want us to believe in, the fiction of being individuals, of needing nobody, of standing alone, the destruction of any sociality. That is the danger. And it's a danger that is carried and implemented by an economic system which is predicated on the fact that if you don't make it, first of all, you are on your own. If you don't make it, it's your fault. Or worse, for the poor among us, is the fault of the foreigner. That is a danger. And it's a danger that is also carried by forces, technological forces, or abetted by technological forces. So when those two things, the force of the market, the forces of technology and media, when all of that is espoused by a bureaucracy and a state and a set of institutions, you can imagine the disaster it can produce. So I don't know what we're talking about, but it seems to me that in order to have a little bit of clarity about where we are today, where do we stand, what is threatening us, how to give a chance to the project of self-determination and therefore of freedom, it seems to me that in order to address those absolutely fundamental issues, we need to have lucidity about some of the conundrum we have been talking about through this conversation.
Let me go to the supposed exceptions then. Interesting two examples in the trajectory that you are describing of a nonetheless long durée period of despotism, tyranny, under different modalities, models, and frameworks. When one then looks at the continent, one is tempted to insist that something like Rwanda, for instance, with Paul Kagame, is a different authoritarianism, which Paul himself doesn't want the label of being a democrat. And then the South African example, where unlike other places, the time of elections is not the time that comes with death, massacre. It actually is a time of participation, and you see different forms of power shifting, local and national. Now we know, without a single drop of blood, a certain insistence on the independent judiciary, a robust culture of criticism, public freedoms of speech, particularly demonstrated in liberal media and the public intellectuals that are able to speak back at whether it be the president, the judge, or the police. What do we make? Are these examples, exceptions, and what do they say to the future you are sort of profiling, the future of the gut that is opening up?
Very interesting. Two things to think about. One is a cold observation about the fact that our continent, taken as it is, meaning different states, I don't remember how many, I think 54 states. Those 54 states are not going exactly in the same direction. In fact, a huge part of what is going on is that we are witnessing a deepening process of differentiation and bifurcation. Differentiation in the sense that some countries have been able to make progress, so to say, and in different areas, while others were either stagnating or basically imploding. Differentiation and bifurcation also in the sense that, for instance, on economic terms, some have been able to attract more private investment than others, precisely because they have been more astute in negotiating the constraints of a global financial economic system, which requires a number of practices of conformity if you want more money. I was recently, last week in fact, in Senegal and Ivory Coast, two countries rather stable. Ivory Coast has been able to make huge progress after having gone through a terrible war, a civil war, let's say 10 or 15 years ago. Senegal has been rather stable, but now, because of the fight at the top of the state between the president, the former prime minister, clearly there is a risk of instability coming in what was up to now the most democratic society in West Africa. So we have that differentiation and bifurcation. Now you mentioned Rwanda and South Africa. We know where Rwanda is coming from. In fact, the cataclysm, the genocide in Rwanda, happens exactly the same year as South Africa is emerging out of its own dark age. Kagame, to his credit, has been able to rebuild a state, reinstitute a sense of contract between the rulers and the ruled. In the process, Rwanda has been able to evidence progress in terms of people's everyday life, satisfaction of their basic needs, order, and stability. This has been done at a price, a regional price, in the sense that, as we all know, Rwanda's relations with its biggest neighbor, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has been characterized by structural violence, which has cost millions of people. So we have the millions who were killed during the genocide, but we also have millions who have been killed during the wars, most of them having to do with resources in eastern Congo. And Kagame carries a lot of that with him. He has some responsibility in that. So the question of the price society has to pay for what kind of political order is something that has to be factored in the discussion. I'm not saying that he is the only responsible for this, but if ever the time comes to account for the millions of lives lost in the eastern Congo, the amount of resources that have been pillaged, who has benefited from all of that, I think he will be called at least to testify. The South African case is clearly very different. We know the long history of South Africa and the capacity South African society has had to give to itself a chance to start anew. Not every society in the world has manifested that capacity, the capacity to start anew, which means to reshape the contours of what a political community is, how it is organized, how do we create a sense of commonality. South Africa has been able to do that to a large extent. Its democratic structures are relatively strong. You mentioned some of them. The political consciousness of its people is also very strong, and their capacity to organize and to voice their claims either on the state or any other important actor. This doesn't mean that this country is not facing some major risks, including risks to its democratic system. Those who live here, we are pretty well aware of some of them. The two most urgent, or let's say pressing risks are, for instance, the emergence of and the crystallization, institutionalization of guts politics, of which we were talking about a moment ago. A form of visceral politics in which reason is not the governing, regulating principle. A kind of guts politics which draws on the resources of hate and stigmatization. One has to be very careful with those forces because they contradict most of what South Africa has stood for in its own eyes, in the eyes of the continent, in the eyes of the world. And shattering that mirror will not be without consequences for everyone involved. The other risk has to do with the hyper-privatization of most of the common public institutions and goods, the infiltration of key regulatory institutions by private interests, some of them quasi-criminal. And crime and democracy, substantive democracy, don't usually go along. But I've lived here for 25 years. I think that South Africa has the resources to address these issues and carve out a path of its own, which leads to the betterment of its people's lives.
Isn't it, maybe final question, isn't there also the enduring third problem of racial inequality? Has South Africa, in a test, in an exam room, what would it get on that the challenge for the historic resolution of racial capitalist extraction, white privilege, white supremacy, to the extent particularly that some of the forces informed by this interest are actively trying to open South Africa up to imperialist infiltration. And quite frankly, up until this year, the preoccupation had been the coincidence of the rise of the Trump administration with its PayPal mafia, which finds its historic origins in South Africa's Afrikaner community, white community, on the one hand, and the coincidence thereof with the white genocide project and the insistence on a privileged treatment of the white population in a country that is otherwise containing populations that are facing all forms of even worse risk than a white, privileged, often more comfortable by comparison to the rest of the populations. How do you rate that challenge if you accept that it nonetheless persists as a threat to the post-1994 experiment with restarting society?
Yes, it's the third big risk, which should be added to the two I mentioned, and it's a key one. Because the question of racial equality, which has been so central to the history of this place, it remains unresolved. And South African democracy will remain open to attacks, will remain fragile, as long as the question of racial equality is not seriously dealt with. In fact, there is a key fault line of the South African predicament as it has been historically, at least since the 17th, 18th century. And the 1994 dispensation has not brought it to resolution. So a lot of work still has to be done with these central question, which is probably peculiar to South Africa in the continent. I say this especially at this moment of heightened brutalism and fracturation, because the fact that this is the only place on earth where politically black people rule over white people, that fact is taken very, very seriously by the new forces of techno-feudalism. It contradicts their ideology of white supremacy to the core. When one adds to that a number of decisions and choices that have been made by the South African government on a number of international issues, one is not surprised that as we speak, South Africa is a target. Officially or not, it is in the crossfire, and it might have to, for many out there, it must pay for those choices. And one way of paying for those choices that are so flagrantly contradicting hegemonic global forces is one way of doing so is to bring this country into the kind of disunion and warfare, civil warfare, that we thought we had overcome. So engineering internal disorder and internecine warfare within South Africa itself is clearly something that can be activated. We wouldn't be surprised if it were, because the internal fractures within this society are so vivid and in fact so blatant that anyone who wants to push them could theoretically do so. So it begins with, of course, antipathy with foreigners. But the foreigner ideology, part of it is that it is so extensible. It has no limits, in fact, because the moment we begin to look into who is a foreigner, how do we identify, how do we recognize them? Are they 100% foreigner, or maybe 90%, or maybe 70%? The more we go into that path, the more we go deeper into dissection. And it would be terrible for any society to undergo that kind of process of dissection. We don't know where it stops. So that's it calls for a new investment in really let's say imagining a South African project, a South African idea that is consonant with what this country said it was doing since 1994. I say it because each society has a really dark part of itself. And the work of the political, in the best sense of the word, is to civilize, constantly civilize, domesticate, and regulate that dark side each society has, which in Rwanda resulted in
The
a
genocide.
cataclysmic event of the genocide. Elsewhere, it results usually in shedding blood, lots of it. It has to do with that. So democracy in that sense is, how is it that we civilize that dark side of ours, which during the slave trade resulted in us selling millions of hours to the Americas. So how we do that is the task of the political, is the task of substantive democracy. And no society can say, okay, I have domesticated that dark side enough to rest in peace. And the danger in the current configuration is that external forces, knowing very well where the lines of fractures are, would invest massively, both financially, technologically, diplomatically, I don't even mention militarily, to render the situation untenable.
Many people maybe forget the proposition of apartheid rested on the logic of separation, separate development, in order to continue white settler population. That intellectuals of apartheid understood the survival of the settler European community to depend on the separation, on a trajectory of industrial capitalist development that is fundamentally based on separation. Remember, that rises after the union, the failure to have the Transvaal and the Orange Free State exist as countries. And when the union is formed, by the 1940s, the intellectuals that had been defeated by the union chaps draw back to the question of separation, because they argue against smarts. This is fundamental, because that way you will have the 5 million white settler population existing on its own trajectory. And then it's, 3 million Sotos, maybe 3 million or 2 million Tswanas. You all look like you are 9 million Zulus, maybe 7 million Xhosas. They must be separated. In that separate way, white people look like a very large group, because the African Unity Project that defeats them in 94 almost, makes their disappearance a very, very powerful possibility. If the intellectuals of apartheid were to win the day, South Africa will be dismembered. It will have to go back to funding, investing into all cessation movements. If then that's the case, let us have KwaZulu, the Republic of KwaZulu. Let's have Kazankulu, let's have, and all of that. Maybe people forget that in 1994, what really was defeated is the project of separation, which 100% depended on Africans, separating. Hence the funding, the development, the militarization of Inkatha, of Bophuthatswana, to insist that the union must fall apart. I don't know. I don't know if this place will withstand this current challenge, because above all, it's in the best interest of the survival of a white supremacist project than it is really, because the rest of them will continue as rural people, as the stands, as rural who must wake up and dance and wait for jobs and no development, no high possibilities of being part of the continued international existence. They will go back to these small, unviable states.
Sure.
And in that sense, I mean, you think about Botswana, it's not a viable state. Zimbabwe, it's not a viable state. Lesotho and Swaziland are even laughable. How can they stand in a trade deal? How can Swaziland stand in a trade negotiation deal with China? They're gonna lose. They're not gonna be able to do any. And that's, I think, the sort of sign. What is possibly wanting to occur, in a sense that the continued dismembering and falling apart of the union. And xenophobia is a proper instrumentalized movement towards that direction. It's 2 minutes away, really, from that.
You see, that's where we need not just intellectuals, a society to be historically conscious, because a society that is in a state of amnesia and absence of critical reflection on its past will go nowhere, frankly. I just don't see where it can go. And the manufacturing of amnesia is also a key factor of our times. And the reduction of history into instant, the fragmentation of time, all of that is part of those forces of the now that blunt political and historical consciousness. And we started with a discussion on the past and the future of the idea of self-determination in a world that is at war with its many parts. And we evoked the fact that a key feature of the times we live in is the attempt many are involved in at excluding others. Separation, in other terms, secession, partition, and dissection. All of those terms apply precisely to the process you were describing, which happened yesterday and wasn't long ago, which means that some memory of it, of these techniques, is still there. So you're absolutely right. I mean, it's happening here in a certain way. It's happening in the Congo. It's happening. I keep coming back to Sudan. It's happening in Cameroon, Anglophone, Francophone, ethnic groups, religious groups. The effort of looking into those factors which in fact can unite, but which can also divide. The destruction of relations, basically, and the substitution with one single form of relationships of enmity and hostility. That is the cultural moment we live in. And no country, no society is immune from such dangers, which raises therefore the question of how do we confront it? We confront it with reinvestment in deep critical thought, This is absolutely important so that we keep awake the critical faculties the times we live in are trying to put to sleep. Narcosis, as they call it. We confront such challenges with new forms of education and training. I don't have another term for that, but Biko spoke about it very, very well. Political consciousness is not spontaneous. It has to be cultivated, it has to be nurtured, it has to be accompanied through methodical processes of exchange of knowledge and share of knowledge within institutions which are part of the public good. So we need at the helm of the state people who understand that. Those who rule us, we need people with intellect. There are of course different kinds of intellect. When I say intellect, I'm not just referring to those who go to school, have degrees and all of that. There are many different forms of social expertise, and we have to harness all of that at the service of a certain idea of being in common, nationally, but more importantly so continentally. And I think that those challenges are particularly acute in South Africa because of the place South Africa has come to hold in African and global imagination. And we need to hold on to that place. It's important for South Africa and for the continent. But this is also, of course, it applies to other parts of our continent. And look, if the conversation we have had can serve that purpose, then I guess you will be very happy.
Of course.
Me too.
Merci beaucoup, Professor.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.